This presentation is going to focus on the personal and community nutrition factors. Our objectives today is to identify factors that influence your food selection. You will be able to describe the dietary guidelines for Americans, discuss the relationship between dietary guidelines, My Plate, and the daily food plan. You will be able to list information required on the nutrition facts panel, and then also explain the purpose of food label descriptors and health claims. As an adult, ultimately, we are responsible for what we are eating. Although there's some external forces that affect our food choices every day, we have to consciously decide if we need to modify those forces or if we can. And being accountable for our nutritional status and health does require some adjusting, sometimes of our personal goals, so that we can allow time to work on achieving our overall wellness goals. And just because you're a healthcare professional, a nurse, a nursing student, doesn't necessarily mean that you can achieve this right away yourself. And so think about your own struggles and trying to reach a wellness goal and have that same, or let that provide an empathy to provide compassionate care for your patients. It's not easy. Let's define some terms. Food selection. This is our overall, when we talk about our food preferences, this is like what we would prefer to eat, even if we've had any other choice. We can eat whatever we want. All the foods are available at the same time and in the same quantity. This is our food preference. There are factors that affect our preference: genetic factors, environmental effects, and the media. Think about the genetic determinants. Perhaps we have an inborn desire for sweet and salty flavors. Maybe this is the flavor profile of our ethnic makeup. Studies of taste receptors have noted that because of variations in genetic taste markers, some people are super tasters, so to speak. And these super tasters experience the taste of vegetables such as broccoli and Brussels sprouts as being very bitter. And so they avoid those foods altogether. And other people will find this flavor enjoyable. So it's not, not everybody has the same experience with this exact same food because of our taste bud and our taste receptors. If some people avoid a particular food because they are perceiving it as bitter, will this be a higher risk for cancer for some patients? Just something to think about. Because broccoli and Brussels sprouts, actually, they have a vast array of nutrients and substances that are associated with decreasing the risk of developing certain cancers. Environmental effects are these learned preferences. And this has to be through, or it's a result of, our cultural and social economic influences. Because we're around our families most of the time and what they eat impacts what we eat, it's a significant factor in the choices that we make. The dietary patterns we experience as children often affect our lives as adults, and this is highly researched. In fact, even the food a mother eats during the prenatal period affects the preferences of that child in the future. Additionally, through television, internet, digital, social media, they all impact, and they have a particular potent force on what we eat and what we prefer and what we buy. Good marketing. Programs, websites, social media, they all spread messages about food and lifestyle preferences of different social economic groups. So think about a TV show perhaps that shows an average working class family in America, and they have a dinner table scene, or maybe they're out in a restaurant. What are they eating? Versus another TV show, if it is a family with the higher social economic class, what are they eating in that particular scene? So these things that sometimes feel a little unintentional may be intentional in fact. Health promotion issues are tied to food preferences, and if we recommend to a patient with a certain food preference not to eat that food altogether, you may not get the efficacy that you want in that food change. So trying to recommend changes for foods in which these preferences are rooted in genetic determinants can be a motivation for change that needs to be different from the food preference that we have learned altogether. So, what does that mean? It means that if someone has grown up on a particular food and this is a staple of their diet, perhaps consider how we can make changes without eliminating that food altogether. So, keeping in mind the cultural differences and even sometimes the religious differences that impact someone's food choice. So, what is food choice? These concern the specific foods that are convenient to choose when we are actually ready to eat. And rarely are our preferred foods available at all times, right? And so, even though we have our preference for what we want to eat, doesn't mean that it's actually going to be one of our choices because we don't have access to it. So, food choices are restricted by convenience. And as a result, we make some not so great food choices sometimes because of our lifestyle, our schedule, and we tend to avoid foods that take a long time to prepare because we're always on the go. And so instead, we sometimes choose foods that are easy to prepare and eat, regardless of their nutritional value. I'll talk about value for a second. Let's distinguish that from cost. Now, cost is also a factor, but not everything that costs a lot has good value, but not everything that is that doesn't cost a lot does not have a good value, right? It really depends on the nutritional value or density of that food. And we sometimes weigh cost benefits against time benefits when we're making our food choices. So if foods cost more, but it saves us time, we might choose that if we have the funds. We may decide that a food item, particularly even if it is nutrient dense, costs too much, and so we won't choose that. There are many factors that need to be considered in the choices. And then think about just recently, these companies like Blue Apron and HelloFresh making these packaged meal services and then delivering it to us. Complete meal for complete family. We don't have to cook long periods of time. It gives us succinct cooking instructions and it helps us to prepare. And we don't need to go grocery shopping. Now, these benefits can be time saving, may help us to reduce food waste, giving us just the amount that we need in terms of ingredients. So, is this for someone who can afford this? Is this added cost worth the benefits to someone who is unable to subscribe to this type of meal delivery service? Additionally, the last term here is food liking, and this considers which foods we really like to eat. Many times we may want to eat a food that enhances our health, but do we like to eat it or do we like to eat something else? We may want to eat a salad with diverse colors of fruits and veggies. Sometimes we put fruits in our salads. And do we like that all the time? We may prefer to eat something else. And so we constantly weigh all the factors of preference, choice, and what we like when we're selecting our food. And these are things, they seem very simple and obvious, but these are things that we need to consider when we're trying to help our patients make better food choices, or when we're talking to them about the food choices that will help with the reduction of disease or the tertiary prevention of disease as well.
Now that we're transitioning into community nutrition, it's important for us to understand that individual nutrition makes up community nutrition because individuals make up communities. And perhaps the most significant factor that affects the nutritional status of a community is economics. Having enough money to purchase adequate food supplies is a necessity, however, it's not often the case. And to meet this gap, public health nutrition efforts have been put in place to prevent nutrient deficiencies it includes two federal government programs. The first one is SNAP, which was formerly known as the Food Stamp Program. Now, SNAP stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and it provides individuals that meet a certain income threshold with the nutrition assistance that they need in order to provide the foods that will help meet adequate nutritional requirements. Another program is called WIC, WIC, and this stands for the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children. And this WIC program provides nutrition counseling as well as supplemental foods, but also referrals to other healthcare and social services that women may need, women who are pregnant, breastfeeding, and then the infants and children up to age 5 are also able to get nutritional supplementation, and we are targeting women and children and infants who are at nutritional risk. Both of these programs, SNAP and WIC, are funded through the Food and Nutrition Services of the USDA, or the United States Department of Agriculture. They do have a significant impact in improving the nutritional status of those who participate here in the US. There is another level of public health nutrition that is aimed to combat nutrition excess. And so in the late 1970s, nutrition recommendations came into play in the US, but then rather than focusing on nutrition deficiencies as a cause of poor health, health professionals started to realize that we needed to also look at excess intake of certain nutrients such as saturated fats, cholesterol, sodium, and sugars. And so these government agencies provided a different look at addressing the issue by trying to educate and provide knowledge of diet-related diseases such as heart disease, hypertension, cancer, diabetes, osteoporosis, and obesity that were related to excess intake. Now, each set of recommendations that we have provided by the government serves a different purpose. For example, there are recommendations from the American Heart Association that focus on lifestyle and dietary factors affecting the risk for coronary artery disease. However, the American Cancer Society, they are focusing on issues related to cancer development. And despite these differences and the focus of their recommendations, there are certain consensus that exists on the guidelines for maintaining just good health in general. And these recommendations are incorporated and have been considered in the national goals. So most of the recommendations suggest reducing the intake of saturated fat, reducing the intake of trans fat, total fat, reducing the intake of cholesterol, sodium, sugar, and excessive kilocalories. They also recommend increasing the intake of healthier fats, fiber, complex carbohydrates, fruits, and veggies. And the goals form the basis of all the health promotion efforts that implement our primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention strategies. Now, there are recommendations still needed because 4 of the 10 most common leading causes of death in the US have to do with diet-related disorders. 4 out of 10. That's 40%. Heart disease, cancers, stroke, and diabetes all are related to diet disorders or diet-related disorders.
For Americans, our dietary guidelines come from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, and also the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS. And for healthy Americans older than 2 years old, there are recommendations that are updated every 5 years. And we also have, additionally, through the Foundation of Federal Nutrition Policy and Education, guidance that will focus on what the majority of Americans will need. And so we have like the dietary guidelines that serve the foundation of federal nutrition policies and educations based on the information from Americans older than 2 years old. Now, these were developed Initially in 1980, that's when they were first released, and they are updated every 5 years. And they're based on the latest scientific knowledge about diet, physical activity, and other health issues. And this knowledge formulates the lifestyle and dietary pattern recommendations that contain adequate nutrients, promote health, maintain active lifestyles, and decreases the risks of chronic diseases.
This image is from your textbook and it's looking at the dietary intakes compared to the recommendations. And you can see the percent of the population here in the US and how much intake is on average. And looking at this, you can see that there is a discrepancy on what we should be eating and what we shouldn't be eating, and how much we are actually eating. Now, there are guidelines like we talked about, and these are dietary guidelines for Americans. And the following four major guidelines, if we were implementing these, would assist everyone and they would help us to practice health promoting dietary patterns. So the first one is to follow a healthy dietary pattern early on. So at every stage of life, including infancy, toddlerhood, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, pregnancy, lactation, and older adulthood. What their message is that it's never too early or too late to start eating healthfully. Number two is to customize and enjoy nutrient dense foods and beverages that reflect our personal preferences, our cultural traditions, our budgetary considerations. And the healthy dietary patterns have a benefit to every individual, regardless of age, race, or ethnicity, or current health status. And the dietary guidelines provide a framework that's intended to be customizable, and it's trying to meet the individual needs and preferences of each person here in the US. Number three is to focus on meeting the food group needs with nutrient dense foods and beverages and trying to stay within the kilocalorie limits. We also need to think about the core elements that make up a healthy dietary pattern: vegetables of all types, colors, fruits, especially whole fruits, grains, and at least half of those, need to be whole grains. Dairy, this includes fat-free or low-fat milk, yogurt, cheeses, and lactose-free versions, and fortified soy beverages and yogurts as being an alternative. Proteins, like lean meats, poultry, eggs, seafood, beans, peas, lentils, nuts, seeds, and soy products. Oils, including vegetable oils and food oils, like seafood and nuts. And then limiting foods and beverages that are higher in added sugar, saturated fat, sodium, trying to limit alcohol beverages, and at every stage meeting the food group recommendations. Even with nutrient dense choices, it really does require most of a person's daily calorie needs and sodium limits, trying to meet those standards. Now, MyPlate is an internet-based interactive tool that provides recommendations based on your age, your sex, and your activity level. And you can go directly to choosemyplate.com, and as you're putting in your data, you will receive a personalized guide to the food group servings that meet the needs of your profile. And this is going to be an activity that you will be required to do as part of this course. MyPlate also provides guidance for various types of food consumption, and also trying to help you to replace some of the foods that you like to eat with foods that maybe you can supplement or change to add more foods of or the foods that you should eat. And it does focus on four themes: variety, proportionality, moderation, and activity level.
So MyPlate is not a guide that all health professionals view as being the best recommendation. And actually, some health professionals will cite the rising incidence of diet-related disorders as evidence that MyPlate recommendations don't meet our health goals. We, despite having MyPlate in place, we see higher incidences of diet-related disorders. Now, think of type 2 diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome, heart disease, high blood pressure, insulin resistance. We're all seeing increases in that. And so it is possible that MyPlate is not being followed correctly, or that it's not the best. And as we talked about earlier, the diet intake of most Americans is unbalanced compared with the recommendations of MyPlate. Of the first alternative plates to address, these concerns were developed by the nutrition source of the Department of Nutrition, which is part of the Harvard School of Public Health. And compared with MyPlate, the Healthy Eating Plate, which is another food guide, provides more guidance as to which types of foods in each category to choose on a daily basis. Based on accumulated scientific research, the Healthy Eating Plate includes only whole grain sources with limited intake of refined grains, and really highlights plant sources of protein such as nuts, legumes, and identifies sources of healthful plant oils. Fish, poultry, beans, and nuts are listed as protein sources that are lower in saturated fat and dietary cholesterol. And according to Healthy Eating Plate, red meat is not to be, is to be used sparingly and infrequently. MyPlate just suggests this, but Healthy Eating Plate is really saying like this is what you should do. Now, rather than the suggestions on MyPlate, dairy as a beverage or food to be consumed at every meal, the Healthy Eating Plate actually says water or non-sugary beverages are better. So there's another difference there. Again, so MyPlate says you should have a dairy beverage at every meal or dairy food, but Healthy Eating Plate does not suggest that. Also, the Healthy Eating Plate includes recommendations for daily exercise and weight control. And this can also be accessed on the internet. You can find that by Googling hsph.harvard.edu, and then you'll go to a Healthy Eating Plate. Now, there's also alternative and ethnic food guides that are available, and this provides specific food selections that conform to the general categories of MyPlate, but are considering cultural alternatives. And these guys recognize that the dietary patterns of Americans are not the same, and it really is trying to recognize that there are different opportunities to decrease the risk of diet-related disorders by targeting the focus away from what some people consider American food and what now we know to be a mixture of all types of ethnic foods. And we're trying to find alternate foods that will help meet the dietary needs of our patients within the cultural context. There's something also called the Power Plate, which is represented by the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And the Power Plate consists of whole grains, legumes, and abundant amounts of fruits and veggies. It can also be accessed on the internet if you look up pcrm.org and look up Power Plate. And this is a vegan dietary pattern guide that's centered on plant-based dietary intake, and it eliminates all animal-derived foods and nutrients. And then finally, we have the ethnic food guides that are applicable to North America, including the Mediterranean, Asian, Latino, and African heritage diet pyramids. These were developed by Old Ways Preservation Trust, and they're accessible on oldwayspt.org, and you can look up traditional diets. This is another alternative, and they differ from MyPlate in the number of servings of animal foods, legumes, varieties of fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, and what is recommended. Lastly, we have the More Matters And this is a push to increase fruits and veggies altogether. And you can see with the different food guides, there are some discrepancies, but the overarching theme is that you are actively trying to consume the nutrients that our body needs and not to overconsume. There's also exchange lists for meal plannings, and the lists will include carbohydrates, meat and meat substitutes, and fats. And if you go through the carbohydrate list, it's subdivided into starches, fruits, milks, and other carbohydrates and vegetables. And really, it's trying to encourage a variety of consumption that will help control the kilocalories and the grams of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And you can adjust this to the individual metabolic nutrition and lifestyle requirements of each of your patients. In terms of food selection patterns, these are estimated by assessing government data that's gathered through national surveys and programs. And one approach is to compare patients' choices with the national recommendations of Choose My Plate. And according to the research, the public's attention has now been changing to be really more into health and wellness as a way to feel good. And this approach is less intimidating than having to look good. And so, consequently, the goal of feeling good is easier to achieve. And improving preparation skills and food choices. This is an option where our patients and their families can accomplish this feeling good element by implementing some strategic planning and the use of these resources. So, how is this applicable to nursing? And when we work with our patients and their families, we can be aware of their attitudes toward nutrition and the dietary change. And although the changing dietary intake is a prime strategy to reduce the risk of diet-related chronic disorders, many people are just not interested in changing their eating behaviors. And so we need to try to understand what their belief is just in general. For instance, the belief in snacking. Unfortunately, snacking was promoted and is still promoted by the food industry, specifically the companies that make snacks. And this belief that snacking is unhealthy, some people think is not really the case. Now, when you snack, you don't have to choose snacks that are high in fat, high sodium, or that are heavy in calories. You can choose fruits and veggies and whole grains, and you can accomplish this by choosing wisely. Your little, what we call mini meals or snacks. And so when we think of snacks, most often we think of high calories, lacking nutrients, but we need to reframe that and include good food choices that can also be considered snacks as well. And so we need to educate and remind our patients about the nutritional benefits of changing our diet as a part of disease prevention, specifically trying to emphasize the positive value of snacking on whole foods instead of processed foods. Food consumption trends do reflect the food decisions that Americans have made in the past, and we're going to look at these food consumption trends on the next slide in graph form. But you can see that across the year, specific foods, watching this consumption of specific foods does really reveal information about food substitutions, food prices, and technology that has changed the types of foods that we have and we put in the marketplace, and how we spend more on food away from home compared to foods that are purchased for the home. You can see here that expenditures rose to 50%, a little bit over 50% in 2014, and this has surpassed at-home food sales for the first time. So in 2014, we're spending more away from home than in home in terms of food. But during the recession that we remember from 2007 to 2009, food away from home sales started to fall from 49% to 48.5%. In 2008, it did not rebound to the pre-recession quantity. So what's the implication of food consumption trends? Well, they really affect the nutritional status of the population at large. And the consumption can be gauged by grocery purchase data, which shows Americans underspending on fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, and they are overspending on fats, refined grains, sweets, and convenience foods. And if you're wondering how some of this data is being um, being captured, think about all the different um, grocery store club cards that you're part of, and discount codes and things like that. They are, if you give them your information and it's attached to getting a discount on some of the foods that you're purchasing in the supermarkets, they are probably, if you read the fine print, they're collecting some of this data. So that's how some of this is being captured. So in just as just to summarize, that the foods that we are consuming away from home tend to be less whole than our at-home foods. And so the guidance is that we need to really promote strategies to make more health promoting food choices, even if we're not eating at home. But what are the factors that affect these trends overall? Could be cost, availability, knowledge, and then often time. But income differences also can account for the difference in the variety of consumption levels as well. So lower income households will consume fewer fruits and vegetables, unfortunately, and the cost of fruits and vegetables continue to increase as energy and production costs increase as well. Now, costs may be tied to availability also. So if underconsumed foods are in limited supply to be purchased, then the price is going to be higher. It's just the supply and demand concept. We also take in consideration food deserts. These are areas where residents don't have adequate access to affordable and quality types of food. And perhaps there's just not enough supermarkets or grocery stores in these areas to meet the population. Now, poverty is a common factor in not just rural communities, but also urban communities. So we need to think about other determinants like inadequate public or personal transportation, thinking about how those social determinants affect our patients' food choices. Now think about your own shopping preferences and habits. Do you read food labels? Food labeling was not always required, but now that it's required, it does provide us the best way to see how an individual food will fit our nutritional needs. And the function is twofold. First, it's for the consumer. It helps us to select foods with the most health providing qualities, but also it does motivate, we'll say, food companies to enhance the nutritional value of food products because the label is requiring the company to reveal the ingredients and nutrition content. Food labeling for processed foods in the US is based on standards that were established in 1990. And this is under the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act. Now, although labeling is mandatory for most processed foods, it's only voluntary for fresh foods like meat, poultry, fish, milk, eggs, and produce. But the expectation is that there will be a revised format for nutrition facts label that will be universal across all processed food products. And you should be able to see a side-by-side comparison of the original label to the revised label in the textbook to see what those additions are. Now, the updates that we should now be seeing on the labels have been implemented about 20 years ago, and we are using scientific data, recent nutrition and public health research. We're looking at recommendations from health promotion, disease prevention organizations, and just the overall concerns of citizens that are interested in finding out the information. The nutrition facts panel on the food packaging has to list specific quantities of energy, or what we refer to as kilocalories, fat, and the following specific nutrients in a serving. So here you see the list, the total food energy, total fat, saturated fats, trans fats, all need to be delineated, cholesterol, sodium, total carbohydrates, the dietary fiber, sugars and any added sugars now, protein, vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium. Daily value, or the DVs, this is a system created for food labeling, and it reflects the amount of a nutrient needed as general nutrition guidance. And it's based on a 2,000 calorie or kilocalorie diet. So it's not for everyone, but in general, it's based on this 2,000 kilocalorie diet. And for each serving, the percent of the daily value is shown, and it's shown for each of the nutrients required. It has to be listed on the label, and it shows consumers how much of the day's ideal intake of that particular nutrient that you are eating is or will be consumed in that food, and it's shown on the food label. Daily values for selected nutrients and food components are based again on a 2,000 calorie diet, but it doesn't meet the needs of every individual. However, it will reveal the percent present in a single serving of the product. And so actually, you have to be very careful and make sure that you're looking at the serving size of what you're eating as well. Because something that may look to you like it's a one serving, which is shown on the daily values and the food label, you're actually consuming 3 servings if you consume the whole product. And so this is something that many consumers don't realize and understand. So we need to now look at the daily values of vitamin D, calcium, iron, potassium, but other vitamins and minerals can be voluntarily listed also. Sodium, dietary fiber, vitamin D are updated now to reflect the recommendations from the Institute of Medicine of National Institutes of Health and the dietary guidelines. So as research becomes updated, these daily values or percent of daily values information is also updated. And the percent daily value is useful to make comparisons between 2 different products. So if you're holding a jar of peanut butter against another brand's peanut butter, you're able to see, what percent daily value it is meeting, and you can make that consumer comparison. And you're also going to use it to assess the nutrient content claims and to choose what mix of foods in your grocery cart will help balance the nutritional intake that you need. Uniform definitions for food descriptors is something that we are seeing now more than ever. So think about when we use terms like low fat versus light or low calorie. These all now have to be clearly established and consistent by the recommendation and the definitions that are established by the Food and Drug Administration. And this helps consumers that are trying to control their intakes for specific nutrients and food components to not be misled. And manufacturers have increased the proportion of whole grain ingredients in many products because of the dietary guidelines, but be careful in looking to see that what they are describing as whole grains are really what the Whole Grains Council suggests. We also will see that there are different packaging techniques and words that are being used, and we'll look in the next slide to see what some of these things that we might see on the food labels are. There are standards for labeling foods organic. Fresh produce and a variety of foods can be labeled organic if it meets standards of the USDA. And they have established national standards for food products to be labeled organic regardless of where they're grown or where they are processed. Farmers that produce organic food will really focus on the use of renewable resources, soil, water, and conservation techniques. Animal-derived foods like meat, poultry, and eggs, and dairy products are labeled organic only if they have not been tainted by antibiotics or growth hormones. Produce is grown without the use of conventional pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, bioengineering, or radiation can also be labeled organic. But before a product can have this label, it needs to be certified by a government approved inspector, and it will require them to go out to these farms where foods are grown and to the companies in which they're processed. Now, there are some health claims that are already out there, but have been approved by the FDA that tells us that there's a relationship between a certain nutrient or food and the risk reduction or reduction of risk for health-related condition. So some examples of statements that have already been approved are potassium is related to the reduction of hypertension. Whole grains are related to the reduction of heart disease and certain cancers. A diet with enough calcium is related to lower risk of osteoporosis. In your textbook, you'll find other statements like folic acid is related to a decreased risk of neural tube defects in pregnancy. You'll see things like a diet low in saturated fat, cholesterol, trans fat are related to reduction of coronary heart disease. So there are numerous statements that have already been approved by the FDA. I would encourage you to look in your textbook to see what they are. But the main focus here is that any health claim that relates a nutrient or food component to a reduction or a risk of heart disease, liver disease, bone disease, anything like that needs to be approved by the FDA.